Tonight we are heading deep into the bluegrass state to unearth 8 of the most disturbing true Kentucky crime stories ever whispered about outside official reports. These are not campfire tales or recycled urban legends. Each case you will hear comes from real police files, court records, news reports, and first-hand testimonies from people who still live with what they saw and what they lost. Details have been carefully reconstructed and woven into narrative form, but the bones of these stories remain exactly where they began, in the cold reality of missing persons bulletins, unsolved case notes, and interviews given by survivors who rarely speak on record. Some names, locations, and identifying details have been altered to protect the privacy and safety of those involved, but the terror at the heart of each account remains completely intact. If you are new here, make sure to daily true horror content that will keep you up at night, and hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. I met Logan when we were both 12 years old, 2 awkward kids thrown together in 7th grade homeroom who discovered a mutual obsession with the outdoors. By the time we graduated high school, we had hiked nearly every trail system within 100 miles of Lexington. Logan was the kind of person who could identify birds by their call alone, who knew which mushrooms were safe to eat and which would kill you within hours, who moved through the wilderness like he belonged there more than he ever belonged in town. When he suggested a camping trip to Red River Gorge in October of 2019, I did not hesitate. We had been there dozens of times before, knew the trails like we knew the streets of our own neighborhood. And autumn in the gorge was the most beautiful time of year. We invited 4 others, all people Logan and I had hiked with before. The plan was simple enough. We would camp for 3 nights near the Natural Bridge trailhead, spend our days exploring, and return home Sunday evening. Friday afternoon, we loaded our gear into 2 vehicles and made the drive southeast from Lexington. The weather forecast promised clear skies and temperatures in the low 50s, perfect conditions. By the time we finished setting up camp, the sun was already sinking behind the ridgeline, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost unnatural in their intensity. Logan stood at the edge of our campsite staring out at the forest canopy below us, and I remember him saying something about how the gorge felt different that evening. When I asked him what he meant, he just shook his head and said he could not explain it, just a feeling. That first night passed without incident. We built a fire, cooked dinner, told the kinds of stories people tell when they are young and convinced they are invincible. Logan seemed quieter than usual, more contemplative, but I attributed it to the long week he had just finished at work. He was a surveyor for the Forestry Service, spent most of his time outdoors anyway, and I figured he was simply tired. Around 11, we all retired to our tents. I shared one with another friend while Logan had his own smaller tent pitched about 20 feet away. The last thing I remember before falling asleep was hearing Logan unzip his tent flap, presumably to look outside one more time before bed. I woke to bird song and pale gray light filtering through the tent fabric. My watch read 6:15. The others were still asleep, and I considered rolling over to catch another hour. But I heard movement outside and assumed Logan was already up. That was typical for him. He loved the early morning hours in the wilderness. Said that was when you could really see things, when the forest was waking up and animals had not yet retreated from human presence. I unzipped my tent quietly and looked around. Logan's tent was still zipped shut. The campfire had burned down to ash. Everything looked exactly as we had left it the night before. I walked over to Logan's tent and called his name softly, not wanting to wake the others if he was still sleeping. No response. I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. I crouched down and felt the tent fabric. Cold. I unzipped the flap and looked inside. His sleeping bag was there, his backpack, his jacket, but no Logan. His hiking boots were gone. I stood up and scanned the surrounding area, thinking maybe he had gone to relieve himself in the woods, but there was no sign of him. I checked my phone. No service, as expected, this deep in the gorge. I walked to the trailhead, thinking perhaps he had started hiking early and left a note that blew away, but found nothing. By 7:30, the others were awake and we organized ourselves into a search. 2 people stayed at camp in case Logan returned, while the rest of us split up to check the nearby trails. Logan had mentioned the night before that he wanted to photograph the sunrise from Natural Bridge, so I headed in that direction, practically jogging up the trail despite the steep incline. The hike to Natural Bridge normally took about an hour, but I made it in 40 minutes, my lungs burning by the time I reached the massive stone arch that gave the formation its name. No Logan. I called his name until my voice went hoarse, listening for any response, but heard only the wind moving through the trees and the distant cry of a hawk. I was about to head back when I noticed something near the cliff edge, maybe 10 feet from the bridge itself. Logan's camera sitting on a flat rock, lens cap still on. I picked it up carefully, turned it on, and scrolled through the images. The most recent photos were time-stamped to 6:47 that morning. A series of shots showing the sunrise, the sky transitioning from deep blue to pink to gold, the valley below still shrouded in mist. Beautiful images, exactly the kind of thing Logan lived for. Then a final photo, slightly out of focus, showing the tree line about 50 yards away. I almost deleted it, thinking it was an accidental shot, but something made me look closer. There was a shape among the trees, tall and wrong somehow, too still to be a deer, too large to be a person unless they were standing on something. The more I stared at it, the less sense it made. The proportions were all off. I took the camera and headed back to camp as quickly as I could, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe Logan had seen something, gone to investigate, gotten lost or injured. Maybe he had dropped the camera and was somewhere nearby, hurt and unable to call for help. When I reached camp, I found that the others had returned with no sign of Logan. We called the ranger station using the emergency radio one of our group had brought. Within an hour, park rangers arrived and began coordinating a formal search. They asked us all the standard questions. When did we last see him? What was he wearing? Did he have any medical conditions? Had he seemed depressed or mentioned wanting to leave? We answered as best we could, but the truth was none of us had any explanation. The search expanded throughout the day. More rangers arrived, along with volunteers from the local search and rescue organization. They brought dogs, trained cadaver dogs that could detect human remains even underwater or buried under debris. I watched those dogs work the area near Natural Bridge, watched them follow a scent trail that led right to the cliff edge where I had found the camera, and then watched them lose it completely. The handlers seemed baffled. One of them told a ranger that the dogs were acting like the scent just stopped, like Logan had vanished into thin air. They searched the base of the cliff thoroughly, expecting to find a body, but there was nothing. No blood, no torn fabric, no signs of a fall at all. By Sunday evening, when we were supposed to be packing up and heading home, the search had covered a 5-mile radius from our campsite and found nothing except that camera. Logan's car was still parked at the trailhead, keys inside, wallet in the glove compartment, phone plugged into the charger. Everything he needed to leave was there. Everything except Logan himself. The rangers told us we could go home, that they would continue searching, but I could see it in their faces. They did not expect to find him alive. That first week I could barely function. I returned to work but could not concentrate, kept seeing that final photo, that shape in the trees that should not have been there. 2 weeks after Logan disappeared, the rangers called me. They said an anonymous tip had come in, someone who claimed to have information about Logan's whereabouts. The tip directed them to an abandoned mine shaft about 12 miles northeast of Natural Bridge, in an area we had not searched because it was so far from where Logan was last seen. They found his jacket there, torn and covered in mud, stuffed into a crevice about 30 feet down the shaft. The jacket was definitely his. I recognized the tear in the left sleeve, a rip he had gotten on a hike the previous summer and had never bothered to repair. But there was nothing else. No other clothing, no body, no explanation for how the jacket traveled 12 miles from Natural Bridge to that mine shaft. The rangers theorized that maybe Logan had suffered some kind of mental break, wandered far from camp in a confused state, fallen into the mine shaft, and somehow climbed out before succumbing to exposure elsewhere. But that theory did not account for the condition of the jacket, which showed signs of being deliberately torn rather than damaged in a fall. It did not explain how someone in a mental health crisis could navigate 12 miles of dense forest in the dark. It did not explain why the dogs never picked up his scent anywhere between Natural Bridge and the mine shaft. And it certainly did not explain that photograph. In the months that followed, I became somewhat obsessed with that image. I enhanced it, zoomed in, adjusted the contrast and brightness, trying to see what Logan had seen that morning. The shape in the trees remained ambiguous, could have been a dozen different things, but the more I looked at it, the more convinced I became that it was watching him. There was an intentionality to its position, the way it was partially concealed behind the tree line but still visible, like it wanted to be seen. I showed the photo to wildlife experts, thinking maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but they all said the same thing. Wrong shape, wrong posture, wrong size. One of them, an older man who had worked in Red River Gorge for 30 years, looked at the photo for a long time before handing the camera back to me. He said there were parts of the gorge where strange things happened, places where people reported seeing things that should not exist, and that maybe Logan had stumbled into one of those places. I returned to Red River Gorge 6 months after Logan vanished. I could not stay away. Part of me needed to understand, needed to find some evidence that everyone else had missed. I hiked alone, which I had never done before. Logan and I had always gone together, had an unspoken rule about never hiking solo in case something went wrong. I made my way to Natural Bridge in the early morning, retracing Logan's last known path. The gorge was beautiful as always, but there was something different about it now. Something I had never noticed before Logan disappeared. A weight to the silence, a sense of being observed even when I was completely alone. I stood at the spot where I had found his camera, looked out at the same view he had photographed. The sunrise was spectacular, mist rising from the valley, light filtering through the trees in golden shafts. And then I saw it, just for a moment, just at the edge of my vision. Something tall moving between the trees, something that vanished the instant I turned to look directly at it. My heart hammered in my chest and I backed away from the cliff edge, suddenly terrified in a way I had never been in all my years of hiking. I left the gorge that day and did not return for months. But others did. Over the following year, I started hearing stories from other hikers, people who visited Red River Gorge and reported strange experiences near Natural Bridge. Several people claimed to have seen a tall figure in the woods at dawn, always at the periphery of their vision, always gone when they tried to look directly at it. A few reported finding their equipment moved during the night, cameras and phones placed in different locations than where they had left them, as if something had been examining them. One woman said she woke in her tent to find her camera outside turned on, filled with photos she had not taken. Images of the inside of her tent, of her sleeping, taken from an angle that made no sense unless something had been standing directly over her. The Park Service dismissed these reports as overactive imaginations, people influenced by Logan's disappearance and seeing connections where none existed. But I knew better. I had seen that shape in Logan's photograph. I had felt that presence in the woods. Whatever Logan encountered that morning at Natural Bridge, it was still there, still watching, still waiting. His case remains officially open, listed as a missing person with foul play suspected, but no suspects identified and no evidence of what actually happened. His family still holds out hope that he will be found alive, that there is some rational explanation for his disappearance, but I know the truth. Logan found something in those woods, or something found him, and whatever it was defies rational explanation. I still hike at Red River Gorge, though never alone and never at dawn. I carry Logan's camera with me sometimes, though I have never been able to bring myself to delete that final photograph. I look at it on difficult days when I need to remember that there are things in this world we do not understand. Places where the boundaries between the known and unknown grow thin. Every time I visit Natural Bridge, I stand at that cliff edge and call Logan's name just once, just in case. The forest never answers, but sometimes in that moment of silence after my voice fades, I swear I can feel something listening. The police arrived at the farmhouse on Stillwater Road just after midnight on February 14, 2021. The neighbors who called it in lived almost a quarter-mile away, separated from the property by dense woods and a field that flooded every spring. But even at that distance, they could hear the screaming. When the deputies pulled up the long gravel driveway, they found 14 people gathered in a barn behind the main house, illuminated by dozens of candles arranged in careful patterns on the dirt floor. At the center of the gathering stood a makeshift altar constructed from an old church pew turned on its side, and behind that altar stood Mason, 32 years old, dressed in white with a leather-bound Bible in his left hand and a hunting knife in his right. On the ground in front of him, bound with rope and gagged with cloth, was a woman later identified as Sophie, Mason's younger sister. She was bleeding from multiple shallow cuts on her arms and legs, wounds that formed symbols the deputies could not immediately identify. The congregation, if that is what they were, stood in a circle around the scene, swaying slightly, some with their eyes closed, others staring at Sophie with expressions that ranged from rapture to terror. The lead deputy later testified that Mason did not resist arrest, did not even seem surprised to see law enforcement. He simply set down the knife, closed the Bible, and said that they were too late, that the cleansing had already begun and could not be stopped. Sophie was transported to the hospital where she was treated for blood loss, dehydration, and shock. The other 13 people present were detained for questioning. What emerged over the following days painted a picture of systematic manipulation, isolation, and escalating violence that had been building for nearly 3 years. Mason grew up in Lexington, the oldest of 3 children in a devoutly religious family. His father was a deacon at a large Baptist church, his mother taught Sunday school, and from an early age Mason showed what his parents called a gift for ministry. He attended seminary after college, graduated with honors, and at 25 was hired as the youth pastor at Grace Community Church, a thriving congregation of nearly 800 members. By all accounts, Mason was excellent at his job. He was charismatic, energetic, genuinely seemed to care about the teenagers in his programs. Parents trusted him with their children. The senior pastor praised his dedication and theological insight. For 3 years, everything appeared perfect. The first signs that something was wrong emerged in late 2018. Several parents reported that Mason had been holding additional Bible studies at his apartment, invitation-only sessions for what he called the serious students, the ones who really wanted to understand Scripture. The meetings were held late at night, sometimes running until 2 or 3 in the morning. When the senior pastor asked about these sessions, Mason became defensive, said he was simply providing additional spiritual guidance for those who sought it, and that he resented the implication that anything inappropriate was occurring. An informal investigation found no evidence of misconduct, though several teenagers reported that the late-night meetings made them uncomfortable. that Mason was teaching interpretations of scripture that contradicted what they learned in regular church services. In March of 2019, the situation escalated. A parent discovered disturbing text messages on their son's phone. Messages from Mason discussing the need to separate from corrupting influences, including family members who did not truly understand God's will. The messages suggested that Mason was planning to start his own ministry, a community of true believers who would live according to principles that mainstream Christianity had abandoned. When confronted, Mason resigned from Grace Community Church effective immediately. He told the senior pastor that the congregation had become spiritually dead, that God had called him to minister to those who were ready to accept harder truths, and that he would not be silenced by people who valued comfort over salvation. Mason's family was devastated by the resignation and the circumstances surrounding it. His father tried to intervene, attempted to convince Mason to seek counseling, but Mason refused, said his father had spent so long playing church that he had forgotten what real faith required. Sophie, who was 19 at the time and had always looked up to her older brother, was the only family member Mason remained in contact with. He told her that God had shown him visions that terrible things were coming and that only those who purified themselves through suffering would survive. Sophie, who had struggled with depression and was looking for purpose, found Mason's certainty compelling. She began attending the meetings he organized in his apartment. By summer of 2019, Mason had gathered a core group of 12 followers, mostly young adults between the ages of 18 and 30, people who were isolated, searching, vulnerable. Sophie was among them. Mason convinced the group to pool their resources, to cut ties with family members who did not support their spiritual journey, and to move to a property he had located in Harlan County, an old tobacco farm that had been abandoned for years. The property had a house, a barn, and 60 acres of woods. Mason called it their sanctuary, the place where they would prepare for what was coming. The group moved to the farm in August. Mason implemented strict rules. Members surrendered their phones and had limited contact with the outside world. They followed a rigid schedule of prayer, work, and study sessions where Mason delivered increasingly extreme teachings. He convinced them that modern medicine was a form of idolatry, that relying on doctors showed lack of faith in God's power to heal. He taught that pain was purification, that suffering brought them closer to divine truth, that those who could not endure hardship were weak in spirit and endangered the entire community. The first death occurred in December of 2019. A member named Thomas, who had type 1 diabetes, became critically ill after Mason forbade him from taking insulin. Mason told the group that Thomas's dependence on medication demonstrated insufficient faith, that if Thomas truly believed, God would regulate his blood sugar naturally. The group prayed over Thomas for 3 days while his condition deteriorated. By the time anyone questioned whether medical intervention might be necessary, Thomas was unconscious. He died on December 18th. Mason gathered the group and explained that Thomas had failed the test, that his death was God's judgment on weak faith, and that they should be grateful for the lesson his passing provided. They buried Thomas on the property without reporting the death. Several members wanted to leave after that, but Mason had convinced them that going to the authorities would mean persecution, that the outside world would not understand, and that abandoning the community meant abandoning salvation. The second death came in April of 2020. A woman named Rebecca developed what appeared to be appendicitis. Mason diagnosed it as demonic oppression, a physical manifestation of spiritual contamination. He prescribed fasting and continuous prayer. Rebecca's pain increased over 5 days until she could barely move. Mason instructed several members to hold her down while he performed what he called a cleansing ritual, pressing his hands into her abdomen and commanding the demon to leave. Rebecca screamed until she lost consciousness. She died that night. Again, Mason explained this as divine judgment, Rebecca's own sins causing her death. A warning to the others about the consequences of hidden wickedness. They buried her next to Thomas. The third death occurred in September. A young man named Aaron had questioned Mason's teachings openly, suggesting that perhaps they should reconsider some of the more extreme practices. Mason declared that Aaron was possessed, that a spirit of rebellion had entered him and was trying to corrupt the community. He ordered the group to participate in an exorcism, a 3-day ritual involving fasting, sleep deprivation, and physical restraints. Aaron was tied to a chair in the barn and subjected to continuous prayer, shouting, and according to later testimony, beatings intended to drive out the evil spirit. Aaron died on the 3rd day. The official cause later determined to be cardiac arrest brought on by extreme dehydration and trauma. The group buried him with the others. By this point, several members were living in constant fear, afraid to leave because Mason had convinced them that abandoning the community meant eternal damnation, afraid to stay because they had witnessed 3 deaths and suspected they might be next. Sophie had watched all of this unfold, had participated in the rituals, had helped dig the graves, but some part of her recognized that what was happening was not divine guidance, but something far darker. In early February of 2021, Sophie told Mason she wanted to visit their parents, that she needed time away from the farm to think. Mason's response was immediate and terrifying. He declared that Sophie's desire to leave proved she was contaminated, that something had entered her and was trying to destroy their work, and that she required the most intensive cleansing they had yet attempted. On February 13th, Mason announced that God had commanded him to perform a purification ritual on Sophie, that it would be painful but necessary, that if she survived, she would emerge spiritually perfected, and that if she died, it would prove she had never truly belonged among them. Several members protested, said this had gone too far, but Mason convinced the majority that interfering with God's will would doom them all. They gathered in the barn that night. Mason bound Sophie to the altar he had constructed and began the ritual, using the knife to carve symbols into her skin while reciting scripture and commanding any demons within her to manifest themselves. Sophie's screams were what alerted the neighbors, who called police. The investigation that followed uncovered the 3 bodies buried on the property. Forensic analysis confirmed the causes of death and the timeline. The surviving members were interviewed extensively. Some defended Mason, insisted that he had been following divine commands and that any deaths were part of God's plan. Others broke down, described years of psychological manipulation, admitted they had wanted to leave but believed they would be damned if they did. Sophie's testimony was particularly damning. She described how Mason had systematically isolated the group, convinced them that he alone could interpret God's will, used their fear of spiritual failure to control their behavior, and escalated the violence gradually so that by the time people were dying, the remaining members were too traumatized and indoctrinated to resist. Mason's trial began in November of 2021. The prosecution charged him with 3 counts of criminally negligent homicide, multiple counts of child abuse for the members who had been minors when they joined the group, and numerous counts of assault and unlawful restraint. The defense argued that Mason genuinely believed he was acting under divine authority, that he suffered from a delusional disorder that prevented him from understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. The psychiatric evaluation was complex. Mason showed no signs of traditional mental illness, no hallucinations or disordered thinking. He was lucid, articulate, able to discuss his actions in detail. But he was also utterly convinced that he had been chosen by God for a specific purpose, that the deaths were necessary sacrifices and that he would eventually be vindicated. The jury convicted Mason on all counts. The The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, Sophie read a statement describing the psychological devastation Mason had inflicted. The way he had taken her faith and twisted it into something monstrous. The nightmares she still experienced about the deaths she had witnessed. She said that Mason had not saved anyone, had not brought anyone closer to God, had only created suffering and death while calling it holy. Mason is currently incarcerated at Kentucky State Penitentiary. According to correctional staff, he spends most of his time reading scripture and writing what he calls revelations. Messages he believes God is still providing him. He has shown no remorse, maintains that his actions were righteous, and has said that history will recognize him as a prophet punished for speaking truth. The surviving members of his community have scattered. Some have returned to mainstream churches, though they struggle with trust and faith. Others have abandoned religion entirely, unable to reconcile what they experienced with any conception of a benevolent God. Several are in ongoing therapy, working through the trauma of those years. Sophie lives in a different state now, under a name she legally changed to distance herself from what happened. She speaks occasionally at seminars about cult manipulation and recovery, trying to help others recognize the warning signs she missed. She says that what Mason did was not faith, was not religion, was simply one man's need for power disguised in theological language. She says that real faith does not demand suffering, does not require isolation, does not result in death. She says she still believes in God, though her understanding of what that means has fundamentally changed. And she says that she will spend the rest of her life wondering if there was some moment when she could have stopped it all. Some point where she could have spoken up and saved Thomas, Rebecca, and Aaron. She knows rationally that Mason was responsible, that she was a victim too, but the guilt remains. I worked the night shift at the Flying J truck stop off Interstate 65 near Elizabethtown from 2015 to 2018. It was not glamorous work, standing behind a counter for 8 hours selling coffee, cigarettes, and hot dogs to truckers making their way north to Louisville or south to Nashville, but it paid the rent, and the overnight shift meant I could take classes during the day. The customers were mostly predictable. Regular drivers who stopped at the same time every week, knew what they wanted, paid, and left without much conversation. A few would linger, grateful for someone to talk to after hours alone on the road. And I learned to read people quickly, to distinguish between the lonely ones who just needed a kind word and the ones who were looking for something else. Hunter started coming in around March of 2017. He drove a dark blue Peterbilt with Tennessee plates, always arrived between 2 and 4 in the morning, always ordered the same thing. Large black coffee, 2 hot dogs with mustard and onions, a bag of peanuts. He was polite, quiet, probably in his late 40s with gray starting to show in his dark hair. Nothing about him stood out as particularly memorable. He paid cash, said thank you, and left. After the 3rd or 4th visit, I started recognizing his truck in the parking lot before he even came inside. He became part of the routine, one of the regulars. Someone whose presence I noted but did not think much about. The first time I had a real conversation with Hunter was in late September. It was a slow night, only 2 other customers in the entire building. And when he came to the counter with his usual order, he asked how I was doing. Not the automatic pleasantry that most people use, but a genuine question, the kind that expects an answer. I said I was tired, that school was getting intense as the semester progressed. He asked what I was studying. Criminal justice, I told him. I wanted to work in law enforcement eventually, maybe become a detective. He smiled at that, said it was good that I had ambition, that most people just drifted through life without any real purpose. We talked for maybe 10 minutes before another customer needed help. Hunter said he hoped my studies went well and left. After that, our interactions became slightly longer, slightly more personal. He asked about my classes, about what cases I found most interesting. I told him about the cold cases we were studying, the ones that haunted investigators for decades. The ones where all the evidence pointed in different directions and no clear answer ever emerged. Hunter seemed fascinated by these discussions, would ask detailed questions about forensic techniques and investigative procedures. I assumed he was just making conversation, killing time before getting back on the road. It never occurred to me that he might be gathering information. In mid-October, my car would not start after my shift. It was an old Honda that I had bought used, and it had a habit of dying at the worst possible times. I tried jumping it with cables I kept in the trunk, but the battery was completely dead. It was 4:30 in the morning, still dark, and I was debating whether to call a tow truck or just wait until the morning staff arrived at 6 when Hunter walked out of the building. He had apparently been sitting in his truck in the parking lot, which I had not realized. He saw me standing next to my car with the hood up and walked over, asked if I needed help. I explained the situation. Hunter offered to give me a jump, said his truck had heavy-duty cables that could start just about anything. I thanked him and we tried for about 15 minutes, but my car was not responding. The battery was too far gone, would need to be replaced entirely. Hunter then offered to drive me home. Said it was not safe for me to be standing around in a truck stop parking lot at this hour waiting for a tow. I hesitated. I knew the statistics about women accepting rides from men they did not know, had studied enough criminal cases to understand how quickly situations could turn dangerous. But I also knew Hunter, at least I thought I did. He had been coming to the truck stop for months, had always been respectful, and the idea of waiting alone in the dark for another hour or two made me uncomfortable. I declined as politely as I could, said I would just call a tow truck and wait inside the building. Hunter's expression changed. It was subtle, just a tightening around his eyes, a shift in his posture, but I noticed it. He insisted that I should not have to wait, that he was heading in the same direction anyway, that it would be no trouble at all to drop me off. There was an edge to his voice now, something that had not been there before. I said no again, more firmly this time, and pulled out my phone to call for help. Hunter stared at me for a moment longer than was comfortable, then turned and walked back to his truck without another word. He started the engine and left the parking lot fast enough that his tires squealed on the pavement. I thought about that interaction for the rest of the week. Something about the way Hunter had reacted bothered me. The shift from helpful to insistent, the look on his face when I refused his offer. I mentioned it to a coworker during our shift overlap, described what had happened. She said I had done the right thing, that you could never be too careful, especially working nights in a place like this where people came and went and nobody kept track of who was where. Hunter did not come back to the truck stop for 2 weeks after that, and I started to think maybe I had overreacted, that he had just been trying to help and I had insulted him by refusing. Then on November 2nd, a woman's body was discovered in the woods about a mile behind the truck stop. A hunter found her while tracking a deer. She had been strangled, her body showing signs of prolonged torture. The police determined she had been dead for approximately 1 week, which meant she was killed around October 26th. Security camera footage from the truck stop was reviewed as part of the investigation, standard procedure for checking if the victim had been seen in the area before her death. The footage showed her arriving at the truck stop on the night of October 25th, around 11 p.m. She went inside, bought coffee, and then walked back out to the parking lot where she got into a dark blue Peterbilt truck. I was brought in to review the footage since I had been working that night. I did not remember seeing the woman, which was not unusual. Dozens of people came through during a shift and I could not recall all of them, but I recognized the truck immediately, Hunter's truck. The police asked if I knew the driver, if he was a regular customer. I told them everything. How long he had been coming to the truck stop, our conversations about criminal justice and cold cases. The night my car died and he offered me a ride and became agitated when I refused. The detective taking my statement went very still when I described that last part. The investigation moved quickly after that. Hunter's real name was Marcus Hunter Caldwell, and he had a pattern. He targeted women who worked night shifts at truck stops across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana. Women who were isolated, vulnerable, whose schedules were predictable. He would visit the same locations repeatedly, establish himself as a harmless regular, learn their routines, wait for an opportunity. The woman found behind the Elizabethtown truck stop was his 5th confirmed victim. Police discovered there were likely others, but without bodies they could not confirm the exact number. Hunter's arrest came almost by accident. 3 weeks after the body was found, he was pulled over for a broken taillight near Bowling Green. The officer who stopped him noticed modifications to the truck that seemed unusual. Custom welding work on the sleeper compartment. The officer requested permission to search the vehicle, and Hunter refused, which gave them probable cause based on his status as a suspect in the murder investigation. When they searched the truck, they found a compartment built into the bed, soundproofed and equipped with restraints. They also found a journal. The journal was what convinced me that refusing Hunter's offer that night had saved my life. It contained detailed entries about potential targets, women he had observed and evaluated. Each entry included a name, physical description, work schedule, home address when he could determine it, and an assessment of vulnerability. My name was in that journal. He had followed me home from work twice, noted that I lived alone in a ground-floor apartment, observed that I was a student without much family in the area. The final entry about me was dated the night my car died. It read, "Declined assistance, too cautious, showed awareness of risk, not worth the effort, moving to next option." The next option had been the woman whose body was found in the woods. Hunter's trial revealed the full scope of what he had done. Between 2015 and 2017, he had killed at least 5 women, possibly more. He kept them alive for days in the hidden compartment, moving across state lines with them restrained and helpless, just feet away from other drivers, stopping at rest areas and truck stops with a victim imprisoned in his truck. The journal described his selection process in clinical detail, rating potential targets on their vulnerability, isolation, and likelihood of being quickly missed. He wrote about the killings without emotion, describing them as solving problems, removing people from the world who would not be valued enough for anyone to seriously search for them. The defense tried to argue diminished capacity, claimed Hunter suffered from some psychological disorder that prevented him from understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. The psychiatric evaluation found him completely sane, just devoid of empathy. He understood that what he was doing was illegal and would be condemned by society. He simply did not care. The jury convicted him on all counts. He was sentenced to death and is currently on death row at Kentucky State Penitentiary, though Kentucky has not carried out an execution in years, so he will likely die of old age before the state executes him. I never worked a night shift alone after that. I finished my degree but decided not to pursue law enforcement. The randomness of it all disturbed me too much. The understanding that survival sometimes came down to nothing more than instinct and luck. If my car had not died that specific night, if I had accepted Hunter's offer on a different occasion when he seemed less insistent, if I had been less cautious or more trusting, I would have been the one found in those woods. That knowledge stays with me, colors how I see the world now. I think about the woman who died because I said no. Wonder if refusing Hunter pushed him to act more quickly, to select someone less careful as his next target. Rationally, I know I am not responsible for his choices, but the guilt remains. She died in my place, and I will never know her name without looking at the court records. Will never be able to apologize to her family for surviving when she did not. The call came in at 7:43 on the morning of January 12, 2020. A postal worker had noticed that mail was accumulating at a residence on Blackburn Road, an isolated property in the Appalachian foothills of eastern Kentucky. The house sat at the end of a long gravel drive surrounded by dense woods, the kind of place where neighbors were measured in miles rather than feet. When deputies arrived to perform a wellness check, they found the front door unlocked, lights on inside, and an elderly couple dead in the living room. The scene appeared to be a murder-suicide at first glance. Both victims had been shot. A revolver lay on the floor between them, and there were no signs of forced entry or struggle. It should have been straightforward, tragic, but explainable. It was not. I was called to the scene around 9 that morning. I work as a forensic photographer for the state police, have been doing it for 8 years, and have documented hundreds of crime scenes ranging from traffic accidents to homicides. I thought I had seen everything that death could look like, all the ways people could hurt each other and themselves. The house on Blackburn Road taught me I was wrong. When I arrived, the lead investigator briefed me on what they had found. The victims were identified as Raymond and Dorothy Keller, ages 74 and 71 respectively. They had lived in the house for 6 years, kept to themselves, had no children or close family in the area. Raymond had been shot once in the chest, Dorothy once in the head. The revolver was a .38 caliber, legally registered to Raymond. Preliminary assessment suggested Raymond had shot his wife and then turned the gun on himself. I began documenting the scene systematically, starting with the exterior of the house and working my way inside. The living room where the bodies were found was modestly furnished, television on but muted, coffee cups on the side table still half full. I photographed the bodies from multiple angles, the positions they had fallen in, the blood spatter patterns on the walls and furniture. That was when I noticed the first inconsistency. The blood spatter from Dorothy's wound was wrong. She had been shot in the right temple, the bullet entering from the side, but the spatter pattern suggested the shot had come from an angle that did not align with where Raymond's body was positioned. I mentioned this to the investigator, who said they would have ballistics examine it more closely. I continued photographing, documenting every detail of the room. The revolver, the shell casings, the placement of furniture, the view from each window. I took close-up shots of the victim's hands, checking for gunshot residue that would be tested later. That was when I noticed something strange in one of the photos. I had taken a wide shot of the living room from the doorway, capturing the entire scene, and in the corner of the frame, near the fireplace, there was a shadow. Not the kind of shadow cast by furniture or a person, but a darker patch, a shape that seemed to absorb light rather than simply blocking it. I looked up from my camera, stared at that corner of the room. Nothing there, just the fireplace and an empty armchair. I took another photo from the same position, thinking maybe it was a lens flare or some artifact of the lighting. The shadow was there again, but in a slightly different position. Closer. I lowered my camera, felt the temperature in the room drop noticeably. Watched my breath fog in the air despite the heater running. The investigator asked if something was wrong. I told him I was not sure, showed him the photos on my camera's display. He stared at them for a long moment, then suggested we finish documenting and discuss it outside. The ballistics report came back 3 days later. Both bullets had been fired from the revolver found at the scene, but the angles were impossible. Dorothy's wound showed the bullet had entered her head from a trajectory that required the shooter to be standing at least 6 feet to her right and slightly elevated. Raymond's wound showed the bullet had entered his chest at a downward angle, suggesting the gun had been fired from above him. But Raymond had been found lying on his back on the floor, the gun next to his right hand. There was no furniture, no ladder, nothing he could have stood on or arranged to shoot himself from that angle. The physical evidence did not support murder-suicide, but there was no evidence of anyone else being present at the scene. The house had a reputation locally. 3 previous owners had died there, all violently, all under circumstances that defied easy explanation. I researched the history while the investigation continued. The first death occurred in 1974. A man named Thomas Wright was found hanging in a second-floor bedroom, the door locked from the inside. The coroner ruled it suicide, but the investigation notes mentioned anomalies. There were no marks on the ceiling beam where the rope should have been anchored. No chair or stool he could have stood on and kicked away. And the rope around his neck showed a pattern inconsistent with hanging. The second death was in 1998. A woman named Patricia Meadows was found dead in her bed, her lungs full of water as if she had drowned. But she was miles from any body of water. The house was dry, and there was no explanation for how water had entered her system in sufficient quantity to cause drowning. The third death happened in 2012. A couple, not the Kellers, but the previous owners, died in a fire. The fire marshal determined the blaze started in multiple locations simultaneously, suggesting arson, but found no accelerants and no evidence of forced entry. The couple was found in their bedroom, smoke inhalation listed as cause of death, but their bodies showed burns in patterns that did not match the fire's progression through the house. Local gossip said the house was cursed, built on bad ground, but nobody could explain exactly what that meant. I returned to the Keller house 2 weeks after the initial investigation. The scene had been released, but the case remained open, classified as suspicious deaths with undetermined circumstances. I went alone during the day, telling myself I just wanted to take additional photos for my records. I brought my full equipment, multiple cameras, audio recorder, everything I had. The house was empty now. Furniture removed by the state as potential evidence. Floors and walls scrubbed clean of blood. I walked through each room, photographing everything, recording my observations on the audio device. The shadows appeared in almost every photo I took. Different locations, different shapes, but always that same quality of darkness that seemed too deep, too solid. I played back the audio recording later and heard whispers beneath my own voice, words I could not quite make out, multiple voices overlapping. I enhanced the audio, isolated the whispers as best I could. The words were fragmentary but clear enough. Leave. Not yours. Watching. I deleted those files the same night, told myself they were contaminated, that I had somehow picked up radio interference or ambient noise from the surrounding woods. I learned more about the property's history through old county records. The house had been built in 1968 on the site of an old mining operation. In 1891, 23 men died there when a shaft collapsed during a storm. The bodies were never recovered. The mine was simply sealed. The company that owned it went bankrupt, and the site sat abandoned for decades. Local Cherokee stories passed down through generations describe that hollow as a place where spirits gathered, where the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond grew thin. They said people who stayed there too long were claimed, taken by something that dwelled in the darkness beneath the earth. The Keller case was officially closed in March of 2020. The final report listed the deaths as murder-suicide despite the contradictory evidence, because the alternative was admitting that the physical evidence made no sense and that no rational explanation existed. The house was condemned later that year. The county bought the property, citing structural issues and environmental concerns related to the old mine beneath it. They demolished the house in August, filled in the old mine shafts with concrete, and posted the land as unsafe for development. I attended the demolition, photographing the process. When the excavators broke through the foundation, they found something. Old bones, too many to count, mixed with coal dust and rotted timber. The remains were removed and buried in a mass grave at the county cemetery. No marker, no ceremony, just earth poured over bones that had been waiting in darkness for 130 years. I still have the photographs from the Keller house, stored on a hard drive I keep, disconnected from any network. I look at them sometimes, studying those shadows, trying to understand what I documented. 3 of the other investigators who worked that case have died since 2020. One in a car accident, one from a heart attack, one from a fall down his basement stairs. Maybe it is coincidence. People die, accidents happen, and looking for patterns in random tragedy is how obsession begins. But I remember how that house felt, the weight of the air inside it, the sense of something watching from corners that should have been empty. I remember those whispers on my audio recording, and I know that some places are wrong in ways that cannot be measured or explained. The Keller case taught me that not every question has an answer, that sometimes the evidence points to conclusions we are not equipped to accept, and that there are deaths that defy everything we think we understand about how the world works. March 15th, 2022. I cannot stop thinking about the pattern. It has been 3 weeks since I started compiling the data, cross-referencing missing persons reports with geographical clusters, dates, and victim profiles. There are connections here that nobody else is seeing. Threads that run through cases separated by years and miles, but united by details too specific to be coincidental. 17 women have vanished from Fayette County and surrounding areas over the past decade. 17. All between the ages of 19 and 26. All brunette, all last seen alone. The police dismiss it as statistical noise, say that people go missing all the time for all kinds of reasons, that looking for patterns in randomness is how conspiracy theories begin. But I know what I am seeing. This is not random. Someone is taking these women, and that someone has been operating with impunity for 10 years. Because nobody will acknowledge the pattern exists. I have an interview tomorrow with someone who claims to know the truth. He would not give me his name, said only that he understood what I was researching and that we needed to talk. Part of me knows this is dangerous, that meeting an anonymous contact about serial disappearances is exactly the kind of mistake that gets researchers added to the victim list. But I have to know. I have to understand. If I can prove the pattern, if I can give investigators something concrete to work with, maybe we can stop this before number 18 disappears. That was the final entry Grace wrote in her personal journal, the leather-bound notebook she had been keeping since starting her criminal justice studies at the University of Kentucky. Her roommate, Emma, found the journal on Grace's desk when she returned to their shared apartment on the evening of March 18, 2022. Grace was not there. Her car was in its designated parking spot. Her phone was plugged into the charger on her nightstand. Her laptop was open on her desk, browser still displaying the spreadsheet where she had been tracking the missing women cases. Everything suggested Grace had stepped out briefly and would return momentarily, except she never did. Emma called campus police at 10 that night when Grace missed a study session they had planned and was not answering calls. The initial response was standard missing person protocol. Grace was 19, legally an adult, had only been gone a few hours. Maybe she went somewhere with a friend, forgot to mention it, would show up embarrassed about the concern she had caused. But Emma knew immediately that something was wrong. She told the responding officer about Grace's research, about the pattern Grace believed she had discovered, about the mysterious interview Grace had mentioned in passing. The officer took notes, said they would follow up, but Emma could see the skepticism in his face. Grace was a college student studying true crime. Of course, she saw patterns everywhere. It did not mean she had actually found something. The investigation began in earnest on March 20th when Grace had been missing for 48 hours with no contact, No activity on her bank accounts and no explanation. Detectives searched the apartment thoroughly, documented everything, questioned Emma extensively about Grace's habits and state of mind. Emma showed them the journal, pointed to the final entry. The detectives took the journal as evidence, along with Grace's laptop. What they found on that laptop was disturbing. Grace had indeed been researching missing women in Fayette County, had compiled a detailed database with dates, locations, physical descriptions, last known activities. She had identified 17 cases spanning from 2012 to 2022, all fitting the profile she described. More concerning, her browser history showed searches for ways to safely meet confidential sources, how to protect yourself when investigating dangerous subjects, and what to do if you think you are being followed. The most alarming discovery was an email Grace had received on March 14th, the day before her final journal entry. The sender's address was a randomized string of characters, clearly a temporary account. The message was brief. "I know about your research. I know what you have found. I can explain the pattern, but we need to meet in person. I cannot risk this information being intercepted. Delete this email after reading. I will contact you tomorrow with location details." There was no follow-up email in Grace's inbox, deleted folder, or spam filter. Either Grace had actually deleted it as instructed, or it had never arrived. Campus security camera footage showed Grace leaving her apartment building at approximately 6 p.m. on March 18th. She was walking, not driving, wearing jeans and a University of Kentucky sweatshirt, carrying a small backpack. The cameras tracked her to the edge of campus, and then she disappeared from view. No cameras in the surrounding residential area captured her after that. Canvassing the neighborhood turned up one witness, an elderly man who thought he saw a young woman matching Grace's description getting into a dark sedan around 6:30, though he could not be certain it was her and did not see the license plate or get a good look at the driver. The search for Grace consumed the Lexington community for weeks. Her parents offered a substantial reward for information leading to her safe return. Volunteers searched parks, wooded areas, abandoned buildings. Detectives interviewed everyone Grace knew, examined her entire digital footprint, looked for any evidence of where she might have gone or who she might have met. They found nothing. Grace had simply vanished as thoroughly as the 17 women she had been researching. Then in September, 6 months after Grace disappeared, her journal turned up in a used bookstore in Bowling Green, nearly 200 miles southwest of Lexington. The bookstore owner, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, could not explain how the journal had arrived in her inventory. She bought books from estate sales, library discards, and people who brought in boxes of used books to sell. But she had no record of purchasing this particular journal and no memory of ever seeing it before. She only noticed it because it was leather-bound and appeared out of place among the paperback novels on her 50-cent table. She opened it, saw that it was a personal journal rather than a blank book, read enough to realize what she was holding, and immediately contacted police. The journal was sent to Lexington for analysis. It was definitely Grace's, confirmed by handwriting comparison and the presence of her fingerprints. But there were new entries, pages that had been blank when police originally cataloged the journal as evidence. The new entries were dated between March 20th and April 2nd, 2 days after Grace's disappearance to 15 days later. The handwriting was analyzed and confirmed to be Grace's. The entries were written in her characteristic style, same vocabulary, same sentence structure. But the content was impossible. March 20th, 2022. I have been here for 2 days. The room is a basement, concrete walls, one small window too high to reach. I can hear cars passing outside sometimes, which means we are still in an urban area, but I do not know where. He brings food once a day, never speaks, wears a mask. I have tried to keep track of time, but it is difficult in this light. I was wrong about the pattern. I was not wrong that it existed, but I was wrong about what it meant. The women did not disappear because someone was hunting them. They disappeared because they got too close to understanding. He said I was right about everything except the most important thing. He said I should have stopped looking. March 25, 2022. I watched through the window today as police searched the street outside. They walked right past this house. I screamed until my voice gave out, but the window is soundproofed. He stood beside me while I screamed, did not try to stop me, just watched with that same patient expression. When I exhausted myself, he said the searchers could not help me even if they wanted to. He said I was part of the pattern now, that I had researched it so thoroughly that I had become it, and that there was no way out except through. I do not understand what he means. April 2nd, 2022. He was right about the pattern. I am the pattern now. I understand what happened to the others, where they went, why their bodies were never found. It is not about killing. It is about continuation. Every woman who gets close enough to see it becomes part of it, and the pattern extends forward in time, waiting for the next one who will look closely enough to find the connections. I do not know how to explain this in a way that makes sense. I am still here, still in this basement, but I am also everywhere the pattern exists. I can see them, the other women, the ones who came before me. We are connected now. He said someone will find this journal eventually, that it will resurface in a place far from here, and that whoever finds it will read these words and think I have lost my mind. Maybe I have, but the pattern is real, and it is still waiting. The journal entries after April 2nd stopped. The handwriting analysis confirmed all the new entries were written by Grace, but the dates created an impossible timeline. Police had the journal in evidence lockup from March 20th until it was released to Grace's family in July. There was no opportunity for Grace to have written in it between March 20th and when it appeared in the Bowling Green bookstore. Yet the entries existed written in her hand, describing captivity that began after the journal was already in police custody. Theories proliferated. Some investigators suggested Grace had written the entries before she disappeared, backdating them as part of an elaborate plan to disappear voluntarily. But that theory did not account for the specificity of the entries, the references to police searches that had not yet happened when Grace vanished. Others suggested someone else had written the entries, imitating Grace's handwriting as part of a hoax or psychological torture directed at her family. But the handwriting experts were unanimous. The entries were written by Grace with the same pressure patterns, the same subtle inconsistencies, the same microscopic details that make handwriting analysis reliable. Grace's family maintains hope that she is still alive somewhere, that the journal entries are a coded message about her location, that the right person will decipher them and bring her home. But the investigation has found no leads, no witnesses, no evidence of where Grace went or who she met on the evening of March 18th. Her case remains open, listed as a missing person with foul play suspected. 3 more women have vanished from Fayette County since Grace disappeared. All brunette, all between 19 and 26, all last seen alone. All were researching unsolved cases before they vanished. One was a graduate student studying criminology who had been writing a thesis on geographical patterns in missing persons cases. Another was a journalist investigating cold cases for a podcast series. The third was a retired detective who had started volunteering with a nonprofit that helped families of the missing. All 3 disappeared without trace, without evidence, without explanation. The total is now 21 women, though the police still refuse to acknowledge a pattern. They say correlation is not causation, that looking for connections in unrelated events is a cognitive bias that leads to false conclusions. I think about Grace's final journal entry sometimes, the one written 2 weeks after she supposedly disappeared, the one that should not exist. I am the pattern now. What does that mean? Was she telling the truth about being held captive, watching searchers pass by, unable to call for help? Or was she describing something else, something that does not fit into our understanding of how disappearances work? The journal is back in evidence now, stored in a climate-controlled facility, a piece of physical evidence in a case that defies physical explanation. Grace is still missing. The pattern continues. And somewhere in Lexington, someone is watching, waiting for number 22 to start looking too closely at the connections nobody else will see. The estate sale was advertised in the Sunday paper under unremarkable circumstances. Contents of home, everything must go, cash only. The address was in a quiet subdivision of Louisville, the kind of neighborhood where homes looked identical except for the color of their shutters and everyone mowed their lawns on Saturday mornings. The house belonged to Leo Harmon, who had died of a heart attack at 73 years old. No family claimed the estate. No friends came forward. The county had tried to locate next of kin for 6 weeks before finally authorizing the sale of his possessions to recoup unpaid property taxes. Sandra Michaels ran estate sales professionally, had been doing it for 15 years, and thought she had seen every variation of how people lived and what they left behind. Hoarders, collectors, minimalists, people whose homes were shrines to deceased spouses or children, people whose possessions told stories of lives well lived or quietly desperate. Leo Harmon's house appeared unremarkable at first. Modest furniture, outdated but clean. A kitchen with dishes for one, a living room with a television and a recliner worn in the shape of a single occupant. Bedroom with a neatly made bed. Bathroom with generic toiletries. The house of someone who existed but did not particularly live. Sandra was cataloging items in the basement when she noticed the wall was wrong. She had developed an eye for spatial inconsistencies over the years, could tell when a room's dimensions did not match what they should be based on the house's exterior. The basement was too small. There should have been another 8 feet of space extending toward the back of the property. She examined the wall more carefully, running her hands along the painted drywall, and found the seam. The panel was designed to look like a permanent wall, but was actually a door, held in place by magnets strong enough that casual pressure would not dislodge it. She pulled harder and the panel swung open. The room beyond was approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, windowless, lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. 3 walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were items arranged with museum-like precision. Driver's licenses in plastic sleeves, each one labeled with a date and location. Sets of keys hung on small hooks, jewelry displayed in shallow boxes. 47 licenses, 47 key sets, 47 pieces of jewelry. Sandra stared at the collection for a long moment before her brain processed what she was seeing. She backed out of the room, closed the false wall, left the house, and called the police from her car. The Louisville Metro Police Department arrived within 20 minutes. Detectives secured the scene, photographed everything, began the process of identifying the items. The driver's licenses provided names, and those names connected to missing persons cases spanning 28 years. The oldest license belonged to a woman named Rebecca Thornton, who disappeared from Louisville in 1995. The most recent belonged to a man named Michael Chen, reported missing in February of 2023, just 3 months before Leo Harmon died. 47 people, all vanished without trace over nearly 3 decades, and pieces of their lives were cataloged in Leo Harmon's basement. Forensic teams excavated the property over the following week. Ground-penetrating radar identified anomalies in the backyard, beneath the garden where Leo had grown tomatoes and peppers. They found remains, 31 bodies in varying states of decomposition, buried in graves that had been carefully maintained, marked with flat stones that bore no names but were placed with deliberate care. The bodies were exhumed, identified through dental records and DNA analysis. 31 of the 47 people represented in Leo's collection. The other 16 remained unaccounted for, their remains presumably disposed of in locations not yet discovered. The investigation into Leo Harmon revealed a man who had lived an exceptionally ordinary life. He worked as an insurance adjuster for 38 years, retired in 2012 with a modest pension. His employment records showed consistent performance, no disciplinary issues, no red flags. Co-workers described him as quiet, competent, unmemorable. He ate lunch alone, never attended office parties, took his vacation days, but never mentioned where he went. Neighbors said he was polite but distant, the kind of person you waved to but never invited for dinner. He volunteered at a grief support group, which initially seemed like an act of community service until investigators realized it was how he selected targets. Leo attended meetings for people who had lost loved ones, listened to their stories, identified individuals who were isolated, vulnerable, whose lives were structured in ways that meant their absence would not be immediately noticed. He befriended them slowly, positioned himself as someone who understood loss, offered help with practical matters. Transportation to appointments, assistance with paperwork, companionship during difficult anniversaries. He built trust methodically, learned the rhythms of their lives, identified moments when they would be alone and no one would expect to hear from them for days. Then he struck. His method varied depending on the victim, but the underlying approach was consistent. He created scenarios where being with him seemed safer or more convenient than the alternative. A ride home from a support group meeting when it was raining, help moving furniture, company during a holiday when they had no family nearby. He drugged them, usually by offering them something to drink laced with sedatives. Once they were unconscious, he transported them to his home, to the hidden room where he kept them until they died. Some lasted hours, others days. The cause of death varied: strangulation, suffocation, blunt force trauma. But the process was always the same. He took something personal from each victim before disposing of the body. A license, keys, jewelry, items that represented their identity, their autonomy, their existence. Leo's computer contained thousands of photographs. The victims in various states of consciousness, restrained in the hidden room, some still fighting, others already resigned. He documented everything, organized the files by victim name and date, kept detailed notes about each person. Their fears, their pleas, the exact moment they stopped resisting. He wrote about them dispassionately. Clinical observations about human behavior under extreme stress. He described himself as conducting research, exploring what people became when stripped of all the social constructs that defined them. He did not view them as people at all by that point. They were specimens, objects to be collected, studied, preserved in memory and photograph. The journals found in Leo's home were even more disturbing than the photographs. He had been documenting his activities since 1995, recording not just what he did, but why. He wrote about feeling disconnected from other people his entire life, unable to understand the emotional connections others seemed to form naturally. He described watching people interact and feeling like he was observing a foreign species whose behavior made no logical sense. He discovered that control provided meaning where connection could not. Possessing complete power over another person, determining whether they lived or died, keeping tokens of their existence as proof of his dominion. These actions made him feel something approximating what he imagined others felt through normal relationships. The most disturbing aspect of Leo's writings was his complete lack of remorse or uncertainty. He never questioned whether what he was doing was wrong. He acknowledged that society would condemn him, that he would be punished if discovered. but he described this as a conflict between his nature and social norms rather than a moral failing. He compared himself to people who collected rare stamps or antique furniture, said he was simply collecting something more interesting. The people he killed were additions to his collection, valued for the experience of acquiring them and the memories they represented, but not mourned as individual humans. Leo's selection of victims showed disturbing sophistication. He targeted people who existed on the margins of society, individuals whose absence would be noticed but not necessarily investigated with full resources. The chronically ill who might be assumed to have died from their conditions. The recently divorced who might be thought to have started over somewhere new. The elderly who might be presumed to have wandered away in confusion. People who attended grief support groups were perfect targets because their social networks were already disrupted by loss, and additional isolation seemed like a natural progression of grief rather than a warning sign. Investigators found evidence that Leo had been planning his activities for years before the first known victim. A journal from 1989 detailed his observations of missing persons cases, analysis of which victims received extensive investigation and which were quickly forgotten. He identified patterns in law enforcement response, determined which victim profiles were most likely to result in minimal scrutiny. He planned the hidden room construction in 1993, 2 years before Rebecca Thornton disappeared. He attended support groups for 18 months before selecting his first victim, learning how to present himself as trustworthy and compassionate. The 16 victims whose remains were not found on Leo's property remain a mystery. Investigators believe he may have disposed of some bodies in the Ohio River, weighted down and released from remote access points. Others may be buried on properties he had access to through his insurance work. Locations he visited for damage assessments where disturbed earth would not seem unusual. Cadaver dogs were deployed to multiple sites, but the vastness of the search area and the decades that have passed make recovery unlikely. Those 16 people remain officially missing, their families unable to achieve even the grim closure of confirmed death. Leo Harmon's case forced a re-evaluation of how missing persons investigations are prioritized. His ability to operate for 28 years, killing at a rate of nearly 2 people per year, demonstrated failures in information sharing between jurisdictions and in recognizing patterns that span long time periods. None of his victims were connected during their disappearances. They were isolated cases, individual tragedies, the kind of losses that happened constantly and rarely indicated serial predation. Only the discovery of his collection revealed the scope of what he had done. The grief support group Leo attended for decades was disbanded after his crimes became public. The remaining members, people who had trusted him, who had shared their deepest losses with him, were traumatized by the revelation of what he had been. Several of them realized they had been marked as potential victims themselves, that Leo had shown particular interest in their situations, that they had narrowly avoided becoming part of his collection. The group's facilitator required extensive therapy to process the guilt of having unknowingly provided Leo with access to vulnerable people. Leo Harmon died before he could be arrested, tried, or held accountable for 47 missing people and 31 confirmed murders. He was never interrogated, never forced to explain himself, never gave investigators the locations of the remaining bodies. His death cheated his victims' families of justice, of answers, of the satisfaction of seeing him punished. All that remains is the collection he left behind, the cold catalog of lives he took, and the knowledge that for 28 years a man lived in a Louisville subdivision, growing tomatoes and killing people, and nobody suspected a thing. I was 16 years old when my family joined the Purification. That is what we called it, though the name was never official, never written on any sign or document. It was just what Brother Jackson said we were doing, purifying ourselves in preparation for something he never quite defined, but described with such certainty that we believed him completely. Before Brother Jackson arrived, we attended New Hope Baptist Church in Pike County, a small congregation of maybe 40 people who gathered every Sunday in a building that had been a church for 100 years. My parents were not particularly religious, but church was what people did in our community, the social fabric that held neighbors together. We went because everyone went, because not going would have been strange, not because we were seeking salvation. Brother Jackson came to New Hope in the spring of 2019. He was maybe 30 years old, tall and thin, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. He had been traveling, he said, moving from church to church, looking for a congregation that was serious about faith rather than just performing it. The previous pastor had retired and the search committee was struggling to find a replacement. So when Brother Jackson offered to preach for a few weeks while they continued looking, they accepted gratefully. His first sermon was about sacrifice, about how modern Christianity had become comfortable, had lost the understanding that following God required giving up everything, enduring suffering, embracing hardship. People listened politely but uncomfortably, unused to hearing such intensity from the pulpit. But something about Brother Jackson's certainty was compelling. He did not speak like someone sharing opinions. He spoke like someone delivering facts, inevitable truths that you could accept or reject but could not argue with. After that first service, several families left New Hope, said Brother Jackson's approach was too extreme for their taste, but others stayed, intrigued. My parents stayed. They said it was refreshing to hear someone who took Scripture seriously, who challenged the congregation instead of just offering comfort. Over the following weeks, Brother Jackson's sermons grew more specific. He talked about corruption in mainstream churches, about how denominations had compromised with secular culture, about how most Christians were playing at faith while their souls remained unsaved. He said God had shown him visions, that terrible times were coming, and that only those who truly purified themselves would survive. The congregation shrank further. By June, only 18 families remained, but those who stayed became intensely devoted. Brother Jackson started holding additional meetings during the week, study sessions where he taught interpretations of Scripture that contradicted what we had learned before. He said modern medicine was a form of idolatry, that relying on doctors showed lack of faith in God's power to heal. He said education beyond basic literacy was dangerous, filling minds with worldly knowledge that crowded out divine truth. He said family ties outside the church were corrupting influences that needed to be severed if they interfered with spiritual commitment. My parents absorbed all of this, discussed it at home, began implementing it in our lives. In August of 2019, Brother Jackson proposed that the congregation move to a communal property. He had located land in a remote area, 60 acres with an old farmhouse and several outbuildings. He said living together would allow us to support each other, to create a community based purely on faith without the contaminating influence of the outside world. Most families agreed. My parents were among them. We sold our house, turned over the proceeds to Brother Jackson, who said he would manage the community's finances. We moved to the property in September, along with the other families, 17 households totaling 43 people. I had no choice in any of this. I was 16, legally a minor. And when I questioned whether this was a good idea, my parents said I was too young to understand what God was calling us to do. Life on the property was structured around Brother Jackson's rules. We woke at 5 for morning prayers, worked until noon maintaining the property and growing food, studied Scripture until evening, attended service at 7 and slept in dormitories segregated by age and gender. Privacy disappeared. Brother Jackson said privacy bred sin, that transparency was necessary for spiritual accountability. We surrendered our phones, our access to internet, our connection to anyone outside the community. Brother Jackson said this was liberation, that we were freeing ourselves from the distractions that prevented true faith. The first death occurred in December of 2019. One of the members, a man named Thomas who had diabetes, became ill. Brother Jackson declared that Thomas's illness was a test of faith, that if Thomas truly believed, God would heal him without medical intervention. Thomas's insulin was confiscated. For 3 days we prayed over him while his condition worsened. He became confused, then unresponsive. Brother Jackson said this was the demon leaving him, that we needed to pray harder. Thomas died on the 3rd day. Brother Jackson gathered us and explained that Thomas had failed the test, that his death was God's judgment on insufficient faith, that we should be grateful for the lesson. Several people wanted to call the authorities to report the death, but Brother Jackson said that would be inviting persecution, that the outside world would not understand what we were doing. We buried Thomas on the property, held a service, and were told never to speak of it to anyone. After Thomas died, the atmosphere changed. People were afraid, not of Brother Jackson exactly, but of failing the tests he said God was giving us, of being judged as Thomas had been judged. Brother Jackson introduced what he called purification through suffering. He said pain was how we proved our devotion, how we burned away the parts of ourselves that were not aligned with God's will. Members who questioned his teachings were subjected to punishment disguised as spiritual discipline. Long fasts, isolation in unheated rooms, physical labor until they collapsed. Brother Jackson called these corrective measures, said they were acts of love designed to save souls. My younger brother Chloe became ill in April of 2020. He was 13, had always been small and prone to respiratory infections. What started as a cough progressed to a fever, to difficulty breathing. I begged my parents to take him to a hospital, but Brother Jackson forbade it. He said Chloe's illness was a test for our entire family, that seeking medical help would prove our faith was weak, that we would all be judged by how we responded. Chloe got worse. He could barely breathe, his lips turning blue, his skin burning with fever. I watched him deteriorate for 3 days, watched my parents pray over him while Brother Jackson stood in the corner of the room saying this was God's will unfolding. On the 4th day, I broke. I waited until late at night when most people were sleeping, took the key to Brother Jackson's office where he kept the community's confiscated phones and called 911. I gave them the address, told them my brother was dying, that we needed help immediately. Then I hid the phone and went back to Chloe's bedside. The ambulance arrived 30 minutes later, and with it came police and social workers because the 911 operator had been alarmed by a child calling from what appeared to be an isolated compound. Chloe was airlifted to the hospital in critical condition. The authorities began asking questions. The raid happened the next day. Kentucky State Police, Child Protective Services, health inspectors. They found deplorable conditions. Malnourished children, people suffering from untreated medical conditions, evidence of physical abuse. 7 people were near death from refusing medical treatment for serious illnesses. The investigation uncovered financial exploitation, emotional abuse, and circumstances that amounted to imprisonment. Brother Jackson was arrested along with 3 of his closest followers who had helped enforce his rules. The trial was in November of 2021. I testified about what I had witnessed: Thomas's death, the systematic isolation from the outside world, the punishments disguised as spiritual discipline, the way Brother Jackson convinced people that suffering was necessary, that questioning him was the same as questioning God. Other survivors testified too, described the psychological control, the way Brother Jackson had taken normal faith and twisted it into something that demanded absolute obedience and justified any cruelty. Brother Jackson's defense argued that he believed he was following divine commands, that he had not intended to harm anyone, that the deaths and suffering were tragic misunderstandings rather than crimes. But the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple deaths directly attributable to medical neglect. Children subjected to abuse. Financial records showing Brother Jackson had enriched himself while the community lived in poverty. The jury convicted him of criminally negligent homicide, multiple counts of child abuse and fraud. The judge sentenced him to 45 years in prison without possibility of parole. Chloe survived. The hospital saved him, treated the pneumonia that would have killed him if I had waited even another day to call for help. But the experience damaged him in ways that medicine could not fix. He has nightmares about Brother Jackson, about the room where we prayed while he struggled to breathe, about believing he was dying because God had judged him unworthy. He is in therapy, has been for 3 years, and maybe eventually the nightmares will stop. My parents struggle with what happened. They genuinely believed Brother Jackson was a prophet, that everything he taught was true, that following him was the same as following God. Learning that they had been manipulated, that their faith had been weaponized to control them, broke something fundamental in how they understood the world. They attend a different church now, one with institutional oversight and trained clergy. But they are cautious in ways they were not before. They question everything, trust no one completely, and carry guilt about Thomas, about the other deaths, about how close they came to letting Chloe die. I speak at seminars now, events organized by groups that work with cult survivors and families affected by religious manipulation. I tell my story because I want people to understand how this happens. Brother Jackson did not announce on day one that he was going to isolate us, exploit us, let people die in the name of faith. He built slowly, established credibility, identified vulnerabilities, offered certainty in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. By the time the truly dangerous teachings emerged, we were already invested, already isolated, already convinced that questioning him meant risking our eternal souls. Faith should not demand suffering. Religion should not require isolation from everyone who might offer a different perspective. Any leader who claims exclusive access to divine truth, who says that leaving his authority means damnation, who punishes doubt and rewards blind obedience, is not speaking for God. They are speaking for themselves, using theological language to justify control. I know this now. I wish I had known it when Brother Jackson first walked into New Hope Baptist Church and began teaching us how to destroy ourselves while calling it purification. Brother Jackson is in prison, will likely die there given his age and sentence length. According to correctional staff, he spends his time writing what he calls revelations, messages he claims God continues giving him. He maintains that he was right, that the deaths were necessary, that history will vindicate him as a prophet persecuted for speaking truth. He shows no remorse, no recognition that he destroyed families and killed people through deliberate neglect. In his mind, he followed divine commands, and anything that happened was God's will rather than his responsibility. The property where the purification lived has been sold, the buildings demolished. The county wanted no reminder of what happened there. Thomas and the others who died are buried in a cemetery now, their graves marked with their real names rather than forgotten on unmarked land. The families who survived have scattered across the country, most changing their names, trying to build new lives away from the community that knew what happened. Some have returned to faith, found churches that provide support without demanding surrender. Others have abandoned religion entirely, unable to reconcile what they experienced with any conception of a benevolent God. I still believe, though, what I believe has changed. I believe in community and supporting each other through difficulty and searching for meaning and purpose. But I do not believe that faith requires suffering, that doubt is sin, that any human has the authority to speak for God without question. I believe the most dangerous thing is certainty, the conviction that you alone understand truth and everyone else is corrupted or deceived. Brother Jackson was certain, and that certainty killed people. I have been a Kentucky State Park Ranger for 11 years, stationed at Cumberland Falls State Resort Park since 2016. The falls themselves are magnificent, a 68-foot cascade that creates what locals call the moonbow, a rare lunar rainbow visible on clear nights during a full moon. It is one of only 2 places in the Western Hemisphere where this phenomenon occurs regularly, and it draws visitors from around the world. The park covers 1,657 acres of Appalachian wilderness, 17 miles of hiking trails, and the kind of natural beauty that makes people forget how isolated they are until something goes wrong. October 23, 2018 was a Tuesday night. I was assigned to the overnight patrol shift, which meant walking the trails every few hours, checking on campers, making sure nobody was doing anything dangerous near the fall's overlook. The moon was 3 days from full, bright enough to cast shadows but not quite bright enough for the moonbow to appear. The forecast predicted clear skies and temperatures in the low 40s, perfect camping weather. We had maybe 15 groups scattered across the campground, mostly experienced hikers who knew the park well. I started my rounds at 10 p.m., walking the loop trail that connected the campground to the main falls viewing area. Everything seemed normal. Campfires burning in designated rings, the distant sound of conversation and laughter, the rustle of wind through trees. I reached the falls overlook around 10:45. The platform was empty, which was not unusual for a weeknight this late in the season. I stood there for a few minutes listening to the roar of water, watching mist rise from the gorge below. That was when I noticed the campsite. It was positioned off the main trail in one of the more remote spots near Eagle Falls, maybe a quarter mile from the overlook. The tent was still standing, zipped shut, a campfire burning in the ring with logs that had been recently added. A camp stove sat on the picnic table next to 2 bowls of what looked like soup, steam still rising from the liquid. But there were no people. I called out, identified myself as a ranger, asked if anyone was there. No response. I approached the campsite slowly, checking the surrounding woods for any sign of the occupants. Nothing. I unzipped the tent. 2 sleeping bags, 2 backpacks, personal items scattered in the organized chaos of people who had been camping for a day or 2. I checked the tags on the backpacks and found names. James and Natalie Crawford, a couple from Bowling Green according to their driver registration, which they had left in the tent's mesh pocket along with their car keys. Their car was parked at the trailhead. I had seen it when I started my patrol. But James and Natalie were gone. I radioed the ranger station, reported the abandoned campsite. My supervisor told me to wait there, that he would send additional rangers to help search the immediate area. While I waited, I examined the campsite more carefully. The food on the table was still warm. The fire had been built up within the last 20 minutes based on how the logs were burning. Their phones were in the tent, both fully charged. Flashlights, wallets, everything you would take with you if you left camp for any reason was still there. They had simply vanished mid-meal. 3 other rangers arrived within 30 minutes. We spread out, searching the trails with high-powered flashlights, calling James and Natalie's names. The protocol for missing persons in the park is immediate and thorough. People get lost, injured, disoriented in the dark. We have found dozens of hikers over the years who wandered off trail and could not find their way back. But this felt different. The couple had left their campsite without taking anything, without even finishing their dinner, and there was no indication of what direction they had gone. We found their footprints at dawn. 2 sets of boot prints leading from the campsite toward the falls overlook, visible in the soft earth near the trail. We followed them to the viewing platform, the same platform where I had stood hours earlier. The footprints stopped at the railing right at the edge where the platform met the gorge, just stopped. No signs of a struggle, no disturbed dirt suggesting someone had climbed over, no evidence that anyone had fallen. The prints simply ended as if James and Natalie had walked to the edge and then ceased to exist. Search and rescue was called in at first light. We brought in dive teams to search the pool below the falls, helicopters with thermal imaging cameras to scan the surrounding forest, canine units trained to track human scent. The search expanded to cover a 10-mile radius from the campsite. Over 200 volunteers joined the effort, walking grid patterns through the woods, checking every ravine and cave and hollow. The search continued for 5 days. We found nothing. No bodies in the water, no signs of anyone in the surrounding forest, no evidence that James and Natalie Crawford had walked away from that viewing platform. Their car remained at the trailhead. Inside, investigators found a camera bag on the back seat. The camera contained photos from their trip. Hiking pictures, scenic shots of the falls, a selfie of the couple at the overlook taken at approximately 11 p.m. based on the timestamp. They were smiling, standing with their backs to the gorge, the moon bright behind them. It was one of the last photos on the memory card. The final photo was time-stamped 11:43 p.m. It showed the couple at the viewing platform again, but this time they were not alone. Behind them, partially visible at the edge of the frame, was a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, features obscured by shadow despite the bright moonlight. The figure stood maybe 10 feet behind the couple, perfectly still, positioned as if it had been watching them. The photo had been taken on a 10-second timer, the camera set on the railing to capture the shot automatically. There should not have been anyone else on the platform. I had been there at 10:45 and it was empty. The couple arrived sometime after that, set up their camera, took multiple photos, and at some point between the first photo and the last, something joined them. I reviewed the image dozens of times, trying to find a rational explanation. A trick of light and shadow, a tree branch that looked like something it was not, a stranger who happened to be there and then left before I arrived on my next patrol. But none of those explanations fit. The figure in the photo was standing on the platform in a space that should have been empty, and James and Natalie's expressions in that final photo were different from the earlier ones. They were not smiling. They looked terrified. The investigation expanded beyond the immediate search. I started going through park incident reports, looking for patterns. What I found disturbed me more than the disappearance itself. Cumberland Falls had an unusual number of unexplained vanishings over the past 5 decades. At least 12 people had disappeared near the Moonbow viewing area since the late 1960s, all during or near the full moon. The cases were treated as isolated incidents, people who fell and whose bodies were swept downstream, hikers who got lost and died of exposure in remote areas where they were never found. But when I mapped them, every single disappearance occurred within a quarter mile of the viewing platform, and every single one happened between the hours of 10 p.m. and midnight. I interviewed other rangers, people who had worked at Cumberland Falls for decades. Several mentioned feeling uncomfortable near the overlook at night, a sense of being watched even when they were alone. A ranger who had retired in 2015 told me about seeing a tall figure standing near the edge of the platform multiple times during his night patrols. He assumed it was a visitor who had ignored the park curfew, but whenever he approached to tell them to return to the campground, the figure would be gone. No sound of footsteps, no trace of anyone having been there. I found references to the Moonbow in Cherokee oral traditions, stories that predated the park's establishment by centuries. The Cherokee who lived in this region believed the falls were a threshold, a place where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit world grew thin. They said that watching the moonbow invited attention from things that dwelled in that liminal space, entities that existed in the gap between light and shadow. The stories warned against visiting the falls alone during a full moon, said that those who did sometimes disappeared, taken by spirits who collected watchers and kept them in a place outside of time. The Park Service response to my research was predictable. They said I was seeing patterns where none existed, that unexplained disappearances happen in wilderness areas, that creating mythology around tragic accidents was irresponsible and would frighten visitors unnecessarily. I was told to stop investigating historical incidents and focus on my assigned duties, but I could not let it go. James and Natalie Crawford were real people who vanished without explanation, and they deserved more than being dismissed as another statistic. I requested a transfer away from Cumberland Falls in early 2019. I still work for Kentucky State Parks, but at a different location, somewhere without a history of people disappearing under impossible circumstances. I still receive reports from rangers who work the falls, people who have experienced things they cannot explain. Sightings of the tall figure near the overlook, feelings of dread when approaching the viewing platform at night, sounds of footsteps on the trail that stop when you turn to look. The Park Service continues to deny any pattern exists, continues to classify each disappearance as an isolated incident unrelated to the others. James and Natalie Crawford remain officially listed as missing persons, presumed dead. Their families have never received closure, never learned what happened during those final minutes when their loved ones walked to the edge of a viewing platform and vanished. The case is technically still open but receives no active investigation. The park remains operational. The moonbow continues to draw visitors, and people stand at that overlook during the full moon, watching light refract through mist, unaware of the pattern that has claimed 12 lives over 50 years. I think about that final photograph sometimes, the image of something standing behind the Crawfords, watching them watch the falls. I wonder if they saw it, if they understood what was happening in those last moments, or if they simply ceased to exist between one heartbeat and the next. I wonder how many others have stood in that exact spot, felt that same presence, and walked away lucky enough to not become part of the pattern. And I wonder if the Cherokee stories were right, if there really are places where the world grows thin and things slip through, collecting those foolish enough to stand too long at the threshold and stare into the space between light and shadow. The moonbow is beautiful, one of nature's rarest and most spectacular phenomena. But some boundaries exist for a reason, and some lights are not meant to be watched.